Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that's probably not on your ideal first date list. Medieval dating. Yep, you heard me right. Picture this. You're at a lavish banquet in a grand castle. Your eyes meet across the room with someone who might just become your lifelong partner. Or, your political ally. Either way, it's going to be an adventure. You might even wonder, would I survive this? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and drop a comment, letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I'd love to know where in the world my little history journey is reaching tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Dating in medieval times was anything but romantic. Well, at least in the way we think of a romance today. Forget the candlelit dinners and sweet words whispered in your ear. Instead, picture grand halls, extravagant feasts, and a whole lot of pressure to marry for political and financial gain. That's right. The medieval dating scene was as much about securing alliances as it was about finding a soulmate. But we'll get to that. Picture yourself walking into a medieval court, maybe in France or England. You're dressed to impress your finest velvet, your richest jewels, because your future depends on impressing the right person. This wasn't some casual meetup at the bar. No, this was serious business. Marriage in the medieval world wasn't just about love, but survival. And what better place to find a match than at a lavish court filled with the finest, most eligible nobility. Medieval dating, especially among the wealthy, often started in such settings: courtly love. The idea of a noble knight pining for an unattainable lady was all the rage. But don't be fooled. This wasn't your typical love story. There were rules, codes of conduct, and expectations. A knight couldn't just express his feelings openly. He had to prove his worth, first through grand gestures and acts of valor. Think jousting tournaments, serenades under moonlight, or slaying a dragon. Okay, maybe not a dragon, but a really impressive battle against a rival knight. This was dating medieval style, and it was anything but straightforward. So, as you sit down at the banquet table, you glance over at the beautiful lady across the room. Is she the one? The truth is, she probably didn't have much say in the matter. Arranged marriages were the norm, and a lot of the time, the matches were made by families or even local matchmakers. Love, it was important, sure, but not as important as securing land, power, and alliances. In fact, historians still argue whether true romantic love was even considered a priority in the marriage arrangements of the medieval elite. But as you look across the room and exchange a knowing glance, you might wonder what was really going on behind closed doors. Medieval courts were places of grand performances where love was a spectacle, a show for all to see. For the wealthy, it was about winning the favor of the king or queen, making connections, and cementing one's position in society. But for the lower classes, Well, their dating lives weren't much different, except without all the fancy clothes and knightly gestures. Commoners still had to deal with the pressures of marriage and family obligations, though their focus wasn't always on securing alliances, but on keeping the farm running and providing heirs. And yet, despite these heavy expectations, there were moments of genuine affection. No matter how much history tries to box them in, people were still people, and love, in some form, was always on the table. Whether it was a love letter passed in secret or a stolen kiss behind the church, medieval love had its share of sweet, personal moments. You've made it past the first glance at the banquet, but now, what's the next step? Are we diving straight into true love? Not quite. The concept of courtly love was central to medieval romance, and it wasn't as simple as it sounds. In fact, it was often more about the idea of love than actual romantic connection. It was about admiration from afar, longing, and the perfection of an idolized partner, someone you could never truly have. Courtly love didn't just spring up overnight. It was a highly structured code of behavior, a set of rules that governed how knights and ladies interacted. Essentially, knights were supposed to show undying devotion to a lady, often someone of higher social standing, and the lady, in turn, would serve as the object of his affection, usually, though not always, from a distance. Now, if you think this sounds a little like an overly dramatic 14th century version of Instagram obsession, you're not wrong. Knights were expected to perform deeds of valor to win the favor of their chosen lady. They'd spend years vying for her affection through jousts, battle victories, and, of course, poetic love letters. You could say medieval dating was less Netflix and chill, and more sword fights and serenades, which, honestly, is pretty cool in its own way. But here's where it gets interesting. Courtly love was often about longing rather than consummation. Many of the knights who participated in this practice didn't even get to marry their lady. The idea was that love, in its most pure form, was unattainable. It was an ideal, something to strive for, but never quite achieve. Historians still argue whether this idolized form of love was a genuine reflection of medieval society's values, or if it was simply a literary creation to make knights and their romantic endeavors seem more noble than they actually were. And while we're on the subject of courtly love, let's talk about one of the biggest contradictions in this whole setup: the lady's role. Sure, knights worshipped them from a distance, but women didn't exactly have a whole lot of agency when it came to their romantic lives. Medieval women, especially those in the upper classes, were often expected to marry for political and social reasons, just like the men. Love, maybe later. And if they weren't married off to a knight or noble, their options were even more limited. The whole system really leaves you wondering how much of this courtly love was about personal desire, and how much was simply another form of social performance. But let's not get too bogged down by the politics of it all. The essence of courtly love was still somewhat charming. A knight sending a letter to his lady, full of heartfelt if over-the-top admiration would often include flowery phrases like, "My heart beats only for you," or "Your beauty blinds me." Like the sun, in a way, it's hard not to appreciate the effort these men put into their declarations of affection. Maybe the methods were a little old-fashioned. Okay, very old-fashioned, but the sentiment is universal, right? However, courtly love wasn't the only type of medieval romance. While knights were off wooing unattainable ladies, the common folk had their own ways of courting, and it wasn't nearly as romanticized. For peasants, love had to be practical. Marriages were still arranged. But instead of winning the favor of a lady with knights in shining armor, a man might win her over with his ability to plow a field well, or his father's strong reputation. That's right, love, for the lower classes, was about survival, as much as it was about affection. Historians still argue whether the concept of courtly love was just a fantasy invented by poets to entertain noble society, or whether it truly reflected a deeper belief in unattainable love in medieval culture. Either way, it left a lasting mark on literature and later forms of romantic storytelling. So, what can we take away from all this? Maybe it's that love in medieval times wasn't as straightforward as we might hope. It was more about ideals, performance, and sometimes a little bit of wishful thinking. So, while the aristocracy was busy with jousts and love letters, what about the common folk? Well, it wasn't all chivalry and flowery poetry. The medieval dating scene for peasants had its own unique set of challenges, and they were a far cry from the romance of courtly love. If you were a serf or a commoner, dating wasn't about impressing a lady with your knightly deeds. It was about practicality and survival. Marrying wasn't some grand romantic gesture. It was more like a business transaction. After all, you needed someone to help tend the fields, manage the animals, and keep the household running. Love, it was important, sure, but it played second fiddle to things like securing land and producing heirs in villages. Marriage often wasn't a matter of love at all. It was a matter of necessity. A man might marry to gain access to a plot of land, or to ensure that his family could survive through hard winters. Women, too, married for practical reasons. They needed someone who could provide, protect, and share the load of running a household. Often, marriages were arranged by families, much like in the noble courts, but without the lavish banquets and pretty gowns. Instead, it was more about who had the most land, or whose family had the best reputation in town. It's hard to imagine a situation less like the sweeping romance we associate with medieval stories, but there were moments of affection, albeit sometimes fleeting. Love was still present, but it had to coexist with the realities of medieval life. A couple might fall in love after spending years working side by side in the fields, and their bond would grow stronger through mutual respect and shared responsibility. They didn't have the luxury of writing each other flowery letters or holding grand courtship rituals. Instead, they had to rely on practicality, working hard to build a life together. That's not to say there weren't any romantic gestures in the peasant world. Sure, a man might give his lady a nice ribbon or a hand-carved trinket, but these acts were often subtle and simple compared to the grand performances of knights at court. It wasn't so much about impressing others as it was about showing love in a way that made sense, in a world where every day was a struggle to survive. Historians still argue whether the emotional bonds in these lower-class marriages were any less meaningful than those in the upper classes. On one hand, the commoners didn't have the extravagant celebrations or idealized courtly love to inspire them. On the other, the relationships were probably far more grounded in mutual dependence, which can be just as powerful as any lofty romantic ideal. At the end of the day, love in the medieval lower classes wasn't about grand displays. It was about finding someone to share your burdens with. It was more about companionship than anything else. It's easy to imagine the peasant man and woman walking down a dirt road together, hand in hand, sharing a quiet moment in between the chaos of daily life. Maybe they didn't get to dance at fancy balls or receive poems in the moonlight, but they still managed to carve out a space for love in a world that was far more concerned with practicalities than romance. And just when you thought things couldn't get any more practical, let's add one more twist to this already complex picture: the role of religion. The church held immense sway over medieval life, especially when it came to relationships. Marriages weren't just personal matters. They were religious ones, and they had to be blessed by the clergy. The church's influence on dating and relationships extended beyond just the ceremony itself. It governed who could marry whom, and even dictated certain aspects of marriage, like how long you had to wait between engagements, and whether your family could approve of your choice of partner. In the eyes of the church, marriage wasn't just about love, it was about procreation, ensuring the continuation of the Christian faith. The church encouraged people to marry, but it also made sure the union was for the greater good. So, if you thought you were just choosing someone to share your life with, think again. You were also thinking about the future of your soul, your family, and your community. Historians still argue whether the church's involvement in medieval marriage was a hindrance or a help. Was it a way to reinforce social order, or was it genuinely a path to moral and spiritual fulfillment? Maybe, as with most things in the medieval world, it was a bit of both. But one thing is clear: love in medieval times wasn't just about personal feelings. It was about religion, duty, and sometimes even survival. Now that we've explored the love lives of both the nobles and the common folk, let's dive into a major factor that influenced nearly every marriage in medieval times: arranged marriages. You see, whether you were a knight or a peasant, the concept of love matches wasn't exactly on the table for most people. In fact, for the majority of medieval society, marriage was a practical affair arranged by parents, guardians, or even the local lord. Love might come later, if at all, but why was this the case? Well, simply put, marriage was more about creating alliances, securing power, and ensuring that wealth stayed within certain families. Imagine being a young noblewoman, barely in your teens, and your father announces that you're going to marry a man you've never met, someone twice your age, perhaps, and the lord of a neighboring castle. Romantic, not so much, but for your family. This marriage was a strategic move. It meant an alliance with another powerful house. Land and wealth would be consolidated, and your family's standing would increase. But your personal feelings, they didn't factor much into the equation. You were a pawn in a game of power, just as much as you were a potential wife. And this wasn't a rare occurrence. Historians still argue whether love had any genuine place in these strategic marriages, or if it was always just about survival and social climbing. For the men, it wasn't much different. Yes, they might have had more agency in the process, but ultimately, the marriage was meant to strengthen the family's position in society. The younger sons, those without estates of their own, often married for land or status rather than love. And let's not forget the incredible pressure to produce heirs. If you didn't marry someone with good breeding and a promising future, the family's entire legacy was at risk. No pressure there, right? Of course. Even in these arranged marriages, there were moments of genuine affection. Some couples did fall in love over time, but it wasn't the foundation of the union. Imagine being married to someone you barely knew, and then, years later, developing a deep connection because you shared a life together. That's the kind of story we see play out in many medieval unions. But the commoners, well, they didn't have the luxury of grand political alliances or power struggles when it came to marriage. Their arrangements were more about making sure families could survive. Still, there were some similarities. Like the nobles, they were expected to marry within their social class, and their families often played a role in the matchmaking process. Marrying someone with a good reputation or a large dowry was seen as a way to improve your family's standing. But at least for peasants, there was a bit more room for love to grow naturally. In a world where survival was a daily concern, finding someone to share your struggles with could feel like the greatest romantic gesture of all. Interestingly, in some rural areas, marriages were even arranged by local matchmakers or village elders, a system that carried its own quirks. These matchmakers might have been your aunt's best friend or an older, wiser member of the community, and their job was to make sure you married well. Someone with enough land, enough livestock, and enough promise to ensure the survival of the family. In some ways, it was like medieval matchmaking apps, but with far fewer options and a lot more pressure. Historians still debate whether these arrangements were inherently exploitative or simply the best way to maintain social order. It's easy to see how these marriages might have been seen as a means of control, especially for women, but they were also a way of keeping communities stable and secure. You didn't just marry for love, You married for the well-being of the family, the estate, and the entire village. But let's not get too bogged down by the politics of it all. The fact remains that arranged marriages were incredibly common, and the couples involved had to find their own ways of navigating this complex landscape. Some found joy in their unions, others didn't. But all of them had to adapt to the system in one way or another. Romance was not the point. Survival was so. And as for the romantic nights, well, while they might have written their heartfelt letters, their arranged marriages were still, at the end of the day, about securing political power and wealth. The real question was whether anyone truly expected love to bloom in these marriages, or if the idea of true love was always a myth, created by poets and dreamers to distract from the harsher realities of medieval life. Now that we've covered the practicality of medieval marriages, let's look at another powerful influence on relationships: the church. For medieval society, religion wasn't just something you practiced on Sundays. It was a fundamental part of every aspect of life. From birth to death, the church had its hand in almost everything. And, of course, marriage was no exception. In fact, the church not only endorsed, but often regulated who could marry, when they could marry, and even who was considered eligible for marriage. The church's role in medieval marriages wasn't just about offering blessings. It was about control. In the eyes of the church, marriage was a sacred sacrament, a holy union that should only be between a man and a woman. And let's be real, the church didn't just think about love and companionship when it came to marriage. It was mostly about procreation and ensuring the Christian faith continued through the generations. The whole love thing, well, that was secondary. If you wanted to marry, you had to do it according to the church's rules. You couldn't just elope and expect everything to be okay. No, you had to get the church's approval. And that meant following a long list of regulations. For example, you couldn't marry someone who was too closely related to you because, the whole keep the gene pool diverse thing was kind of a big deal. But even that wasn't as simple as it sounds. There were debates about what constituted too close of a relationship, and historians still argue whether the church's restrictions on marriage were truly about health concerns, or more about maintaining control over the population's marriages. Some church leaders were particularly concerned about keeping bloodlines pure, but the impact of that thinking on romantic relationships can't be understated. The church also made sure that marriages were properly conducted, meaning they had to be witnessed by a priest, usually within the church itself. This might seem like a simple formality, but it meant that marriage had an official, spiritual weight to it. It wasn't just about two people coming together. It was about the blessing of God. And as you might imagine, this added a whole other layer of pressure for medieval couples. But wait, there's more. The church wasn't just regulating who married whom. It also dictated when and how often people could marry. You couldn't just get married whenever you felt like it. There were times of the year when weddings were forbidden, such as during Lent, when the church expected a period of fasting and reflection. This was a form of control over the personal lives of the medieval people, one that ensured the church maintained authority over the social and spiritual realms. So, if you were eager to marry, you might have had to wait months before the church would give its blessing. And then there's the matter of divorce, or rather, the lack of it. Divorce wasn't really an option in medieval times, especially if you were married in the church. The church believed that marriage was a permanent union, and breaking that bond wasn't just frowned upon. It was considered sinful. So, what happened if things went sour in a marriage? Well, the church did offer a way out, but it wasn't exactly a divorce. Instead, couples could petition for an annulment, which declared that the marriage had never truly been valid in the first place. This was an arduous process and was often reserved for cases like infertility or, in extreme cases, consanguinity, marrying a relative. But if your marriage simply wasn't working, tough luck. You were stuck unless you could convince the church to annul the union for one of the very loose or limited reasons. Historians still debate how much power the church's involvement in marriage truly had over the emotional lives of medieval people. Was it a means of preserving social order, or was it a genuine attempt to protect the sanctity of love? Some scholars argue that the church's control over marriage only deepened the divisions between the elite and the lower classes, as it was much easier for nobility to navigate the complex rules surrounding marriage than for peasants. The church's rules also placed enormous pressure on individuals to marry within their social class, which often led to marriages based on political gain or wealth rather than love. What's fascinating, though, is that despite all these regulations, people still found ways to express love and affection. Yes, it was restricted, but human emotions don't always follow the rules. Behind closed doors, some couples likely found comfort in each other's arms, despite the heavy hand of religion that loomed over their union. And let's not forget the truly unusual marriages that slipped through the cracks of the church's watchful eye. Occasionally, there were clandestine unions where couples defied the church and married in secret, sometimes out of sheer desperation to be together. These marriages weren't recognized by the church, but for the couple, it was an act of defiance and, in many ways, true love. Historians still argue whether these secret unions were more common than we realize, or if they were simply the exception to the rule. At the end of the day, the church's influence on marriage during the medieval period was both far-reaching and profound. It shaped how people thought about love, family, and duty, and ultimately, it shaped the very foundation of medieval society. In some ways, it was an attempt to ensure that love didn't get out of hand. In others, it was a means of keeping power within the church and the aristocracy. Love, though, was never fully suppressed. It found its way in the cracks and corners of society, where it still burned brightly, despite the cold regulations of the time. By now, you've got a pretty solid idea that marriage in medieval times was more about power, politics, and practicality than it was about love. But let's talk about something that added yet another layer to this complex web of relationships: dowries. If you thought your love life was complicated, try navigating a medieval marriage with a dowry attached to it. Dowries were essentially payments or gifts made by the bride's family to the groom or his family. In the upper classes, this could include land, money, or titles. Essentially, a way of bolstering the groom's wealth and status for the bride. Though this wasn't exactly a romantic gesture. Rather than being an act of generosity or love, a dowry was often seen as a way of securing the future of the family. For noble families, a dowry could be a small fortune, while for common folk, it might simply be some livestock or household goods. Either way, the dowry was an important part of the marriage contract, and one that had real implications for both families. So, what was the purpose of this? Was it to show how much the bride's family cared for the groom? Not exactly. Dowries were much more about securing the groom's financial situation. A good dowry could make the difference between a comfortable life and a struggle for survival. Think of it like a medieval prenup, except instead of splitting assets after marriage, the dowry was given before, and it often stayed with the husband. Once the marriage was finalized, the groom had control of the dowry, and it could be used however he saw fit, whether to buy land, start a business, or fund an extravagant lifestyle. If the bride's family was wealthy enough to offer a significant dowry, it could help elevate the groom's social standing. Marrying a woman with a hefty dowry could be an opportunity for a man to move up the social ladder. In the case of noble families, this was especially important. Sometimes, marriages were arranged primarily for the dowry itself. Money and land were more important than anything else. It was a business deal, with love and affection thrown in as an afterthought. Historians still argue whether dowries were a form of economic exploitation or a necessary part of medieval society. Some believe that dowries perpetuated gender inequalities, as they essentially put a price tag on women, while others argue that dowries were a way to ensure that a woman's family could still maintain some level of financial security if something happened to her husband. There were certainly cases where dowries were used to establish power, and some marriages were more like strategic business mergers than romantic unions. For the lower classes, dowries were still very important, but their impact was a little less dramatic. Instead of massive estates or large sums of money, a peasant's dowry might include a cow, a cart, or other valuable assets that could help a couple set up a household. The value of these dowries, while not extravagant, was still significant. Marrying into a family with a good dowry could ensure a more stable life for the couple and their future children. In some cases, the groom's family might even require the bride's family to prove the dowry before the marriage could proceed. This often meant showing that the family had the assets or land promised. Otherwise, the marriage could be delayed or called off. So, You can imagine how much pressure this placed on families, especially on the bride's side. The pressure to provide a significant dowry could even lead to financial ruin for some families, particularly in cases where they didn't have enough wealth to begin with. But here's the kicker. In some situations, a bride could actually lose her dowry if the marriage didn't work out or if her husband died. The dowry was sometimes lost to the husband's family, or the bride's family would have to work out some sort of financial settlement. While the dowry system might have helped ensure that women were provided for, it could also be a harsh reminder that as much as people might want to romanticize medieval love, marriage was a financial transaction, first and foremost. Now, imagine being a woman in this system. Your worth was essentially determined by the size of your dowry. It wasn't about who you were as a person, but what you brought to the marriage in terms of assets. There were certainly exceptions, especially in cases where marriages were based on love rather than social strategy. But for most, dowries were a very real part of their marriage experience. Historians debate the fairness of this system, with some arguing that dowries perpetuated patriarchal structures and reinforced women's roles as property, while others suggest that dowries were just a practical solution in a world where marriage had financial and social implications. Whatever side of the argument you fall on, one thing is clear. Dowries were a major part of medieval relationships, and they shaped the way people married, loved, and lived. But despite all the financial arrangements, it's hard to ignore the fact that love still played a role, even if it was overshadowed by money and power. Maybe it wasn't the main driving force behind marriage, but it certainly didn't disappear entirely. Behind every arranged marriage, every dowry, and every royal alliance, there were real people who had to find their own ways of coping with the system. And sometimes, love managed to break through, even in the most unlikely of circumstances. Now that we've explored the role of dowries, let's take a step into the world of medieval peasants and how they navigated love, romance, and courtship without all the luxury of castles, knights, or extravagant dowries. The reality for common folk in medieval times wasn't quite as grand, but their relationships were still full of the same human emotions we experience today, albeit with a much more practical focus. For peasants, love was a simpler thing, built on the same survival instincts that governed most aspects of their lives. While noblemen were off jousting and composing love poems for unattainable ladies, the peasants were worrying about getting enough grain to last through the winter or making sure the crops didn't fail. For them, the stakes of marriage were high, but not in the same dramatic, political way as they were for the elite. Instead, marriage was more about necessity and mutual support. It was about finding someone who could help you work the land, tend to the animals, and raise a family. While there was certainly room for affection in these unions, the primary focus was always on work. A man might court a woman by showing his ability to contribute to the household, whether it was through skill at farming, animal husbandry, or building. A woman, in turn, would be expected to contribute to the household with her own set of skills: cooking, cleaning, and taking care of children. These weren't the romantic gestures we might envision today, but they were practical acts of love. After all, what better way to show someone you cared than by helping them get through the hard work of daily life? The matchmaking process for peasants was also less glamorous. Families or communities would often play a significant role in pairing people together, and much of the courtship would happen within close-knit rural communities. Rather than elaborate balls or romantic dinners, courtship for peasants was a much quieter affair. A man might approach a woman through shared work in the fields, a simple conversation over a mug of ale, or during village festivals. The key was finding someone who was practical, reliable, and capable of handling the responsibilities of marriage and family life. That's not to say there weren't moments of sweetness in these relationships. Despite the heavy focus on practicality, medieval peasants still found ways to express affection. A man might gift his lady with a simple token, a ribbon, a hand-carved trinket, or perhaps a bouquet of wildflowers he picked on his way home from the fields. For a woman, love might be shown through small acts of care, like preparing her husband's favorite meal, or tending to his clothes after a long day's work. It wasn't grand, but it was meaningful. Historians still debate whether the emotional bonds in these lower-class marriages were as deep and genuine as those in the upper classes, where there was more room for romantic gestures. Some argue that the simplicity of peasant life allowed for more authentic emotional connections, since people didn't have the distractions of wealth, status, and power. Others, however, suggest that the pressure to marry for practical reasons in the peasant class led to relationships that were more about survival than genuine affection. It's hard to say for sure, but one thing is certain: peasant marriages were built on a foundation of mutual respect and a shared understanding of the work required to sustain a household. There were no grand love letters or knights riding in on horseback, but there was still love in its own way. Perhaps it was quieter, more practical, but no less real. But the fact that love played a role in peasant marriages isn't to say that life was easy. In fact, the reality of peasant life was often harsh, and marriage could bring its own set of challenges. While the nobles were concerned with securing alliances and wealth, peasants were often struggling with the constant threat of famine, disease, and poor harvests. If a couple lost a child or faced a year of bad crops, the relationship could be tested in ways that were unimaginable for the upper classes. Yet, even in the face of such hardships, many couples still found ways to lean on each other for support. What's fascinating is how these relationships have been largely overlooked in the historical narrative. Most of what we know about medieval love comes from the records of the elite. The courtly love tradition, the grand weddings, the tales of knights and ladies. But the reality for peasants was far less glamorous. Still, in its own way, it was just as meaningful. Historians continue to argue about the nature of medieval love, whether it was more about duty and survival, or whether genuine affection existed in the hearts of common folk. Some believe that peasant marriages were driven more by necessity than love, while others argue that love had a place in all relationships, even those without the fancy dresses and expensive dowries. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Peasants might not have had the luxury of grand courtships or romantic serenades, but they still found love in the midst of their daily struggles. As we move further into the world of medieval romance, let's take a closer look at the knights, these noble warriors, sworn to codes of chivalry and duty, were supposed to be the epitome of honor, courage, and of course, romantic devotion. But when a knight fell in love, things got interesting. While knights had a reputation for gallant acts, these courtly heroes weren't always the most straightforward when it came to love. Chivalry, the code of conduct knights followed, was originally about bravery, loyalty, and fighting for justice. But over time, it became intertwined with notions of courtly love. Suddenly, knights weren't just expected to protect their kingdom or go on heroic quests. They were also expected to show undying devotion to a lady, often one who was above them socially and unattainable. This idealized version of love became an essential part of the medieval knight's identity. But here's the twist. Knights didn't always get to marry the women they admired. In fact, the whole idea of courtly love was more about longing than it was about actual consummation. Knights were often expected to prove their worthiness to their lady through heroic deeds. Think jousting tournaments, slaying dragons, and defending the honor of the woman they adored. But here's the catch. These knights rarely got to marry the woman they were swooning over. Courtly love was more about proving your devotion, about showcasing your bravery and your skill, and about expressing your passion through action. Love in this context wasn't necessarily about mutual affection. It was about devotion and admiration from a distance. The knight's role in courtly love wasn't just about love at first sight. No. It was all about wooing a lady who was often out of their reach. A knight couldn't just show up at a lady's door and ask for a date. Oh no, he had to prove his worth. The better the knight's feats, the more likely he was to earn the admiration of the lady he sought to court. These knights, dressed in shining armor, would perform incredible deeds just to win the favor of a lady who might never even acknowledge their existence. In many ways, it was less about love and more about proving one's devotion through public displays of strength and courage. Historians still argue about how serious the medieval concept of courtly love really was. Some suggest that it was a way for knights to elevate their status through poetic and theatrical gestures of devotion, while others believe it was a genuine attempt to create a higher form of love, one that transcended mere physical attraction. But for the most part, courtly love was about ideals, about honoring a lady's beauty and virtue from afar, without the expectation of anything in return. It was a beautiful, tragic concept, full of longing and yearning, but with little hope of fulfillment. Interestingly, while knights were pining for unattainable women, their marriages were still often arranged by their families for political gain. So, even though knights were out there trying to win the heart of some noblewoman with grand displays of heroism, their actual marriages were much more about securing alliances and consolidating power. Courtly love, then, was a kind of fantasy, a way for knights to express their feelings in a socially acceptable way, without actually changing the power dynamics of their world. Knights weren't expected to marry for love. They were expected to marry for power. But what about the knights who didn't fall into the rigid structures of courtly love? Well, they still had to navigate the expectations of their society, which were often just as complicated as those of their old counterparts. Knights could still fall in love, of course, but the reality of their social standing meant that their love stories were often restricted by the same political realities that affected noble marriages. It wasn't about true love. It was about the marriage market, wealth, and alliances. In a way, medieval knights had a complicated relationship with love. They were idealized in songs and stories, celebrated for their valor and devotion. But the reality of their romantic lives was often far more complicated. The ideal of a knight's love, in which they could swoop in and win the heart of a lady, was often overshadowed by the realities of marriage as a tool of power. Love might have been the goal for some knights, but it was rarely the driving force in their unions. In the end, the knights' love lives were governed by a delicate balance between duty and desire. They were expected to be honorable, devoted, and courageous. But when it came to love, they were often left with little more than longing and admiration from afar. They were bound by codes of conduct that prevented them from truly pursuing love the way we might imagine today. So, while the idea of the chivalrous knight wooing a lady with acts of heroism is romantic, it's also a little bit tragic. For many knights, the reality of love wasn't about happily ever afters. It was about keeping up appearances and playing the game. Historians still argue whether knights truly believed in the ideals of courtly love, or if they simply used them as a tool to elevate their own status. But one thing is for sure: when knights fell in love, it wasn't just about the heart, it was about proving your worth, whether the lady you admired even knew you existed or not. Now that we've explored the lofty ideals of chivalry and the strange rules of courtly love, let's delve into something a bit more tangible: medieval dating rituals. When we think of dating in the medieval era, our minds might immediately jump to knights, noble ladies, and grand feasts. But the reality of courtship was a bit different for most people. Whether you were a peasant, a merchant, or part of the nobility, the rules and rituals surrounding dating and marriage were highly structured, and some of them are, well, a little funny when viewed through a modern lens. One of the most iconic medieval dating rituals involved the concept of betrothal. a formal engagement that was considered as serious as marriage itself. This wasn't some casual, let's see how things go situation. A betrothal was a contract legal, binding, and recognized by the church. Once two people were betrothed, they were considered married in the eyes of God, even though they hadn't actually tied the knot yet. You could break off a betrothal, but it was as difficult and complicated as getting a divorce today. And the reasons for breaking it off? Well, they ranged from simple disagreements to more serious issues, like discovering that your partner wasn't as financially stable as you thought. So much for the idea of love at first sight. But before a betrothal, there were the courtship rituals. These were the earliest steps in the medieval dating scene, and they weren't as dramatic as we might imagine. There was no swipe right or sliding into DMs. No. Instead, courtship was a highly formal affair, and for the nobility, it was often overseen by chaperones. In fact, in many cases, the couple could barely interact without supervision. At least you didn't have to worry about awkward first dates when a chaperone was constantly in the mix, right? Courtship for the common folk was a little more relaxed, but still followed certain rules. When it came to public displays of affection, there were strict boundaries. For example, holding hands was a big deal. It wasn't just a casual gesture of affection like it is today. Holding hands was a symbolic act that could signal everything from romantic interest to an impending marriage. If you were holding hands with someone, it wasn't just about the physical connection. It was about marking your territory. There were unspoken social rules in place that governed what was acceptable and what wasn't, and these were often influenced by the class you belonged to. But it wasn't all formal contracts and supervision. For the lower classes, courtship could sometimes take place at festivals where villagers gathered to celebrate the harvest, religious holidays, or other important occasions. These festivals were the perfect place to meet potential partners in a relaxed, social setting. Though the goal was still practical, finding someone to marry and build a family with. Still, there were moments of genuine affection, and people would often dance together, share drinks, and chat under the stars. Though the process was dictated by necessity, it wasn't without moments of fun and connection. Then there's the infamous love letters. Now, we might think of medieval love letters as being all about grandiose declarations of devotion, but they were often a bit more formulaic and impersonal than we'd expect. For a nobleman, writing a letter to his lady might have been a chance to prove his skill with words and his loyalty. But these letters were often composed by scribes, not the men themselves. The letter would be full of grand metaphors and elaborate praise for the lady's beauty. But in reality, the knight was simply following the social script that had been established by centuries of poetic tradition. For the peasants, though, love letters weren't quite as formalized. The lower classes didn't have the luxury of scribes at their disposal. So if someone wanted to send a message to their lover, they had to get creative. Many peasants used small tokens like carved wood or embroidered pieces of cloth to communicate their affection. These tokens weren't just sentimental. They were also practical, serving as symbols of a couple's commitment to one another. Interestingly, medieval love letters, whether written by a noble knight or a humble farmer, often followed a similar formula. The writer would praise the lady's beauty, describe the pain of longing, and ask for a chance to prove his devotion through action. But these letters were more than just romantic. They were a way of cementing a social contract. After all, in a world where marriages were about securing land, power, and status, expressing romantic feelings was one thing, but making sure that your intentions were clear and formalized was another. Historians still argue whether these rituals of courtship were more about personal affection or whether they were simply tools to ensure social stability. On one hand, these rituals provided a structured, socially acceptable way to approach marriage, which might have helped avoid awkward situations. On the other hand, these rituals were so formalized that it's hard to say how much genuine romantic connection could be formed within the constraints of these societal expectations. At the end of the day, dating in the medieval era was about much more than just getting to know someone for who they were. It was about securing your place in society, building alliances, and ensuring that your family's future was secure. Whether you were a knight in shining armor or a peasant working the fields, the rules of medieval dating didn't leave much room for spontaneity or modern-day romantic gestures. But in those moments of courtship, with carefully arranged dances and formalized love letters, there was still the chance for something real. Something that, despite all the social structures, still resembled the human longing for connection. Now that we've covered courtship rituals, let's turn our attention to one of the most peculiar and, frankly, fascinating aspects of medieval romance: the language of love. No, I'm not talking about sweet nothings whispered in the dark, but rather the elaborate, often bizarre phrases and terms used in medieval love letters, poetry, and declarations of affection. Medieval lovers had an entire lexicon dedicated to expressing their passion. Some of it truly beautiful, and other parts, well, let's just say it would be considered highly cheesy today. For the aristocracy, much of the language of love was derived from the poetic tradition of courtly love. A knight, for example, might write his lady a letter and use expressions that sound almost laughable today, but were completely normal back then. You might read lines like, "My heart beats only for you," or "Your beauty blinds me like the sun." These phrases were meant to convey deep, unyielding devotion, but they were also very much about performing the role of the adoring knight, as much as they were about the actual feelings of the writer. Interestingly, the language of love in the medieval period was highly ritualistic. Knights and ladies didn't just speak from the heart in a natural way. They followed a set of predetermined phrases and metaphors that had been passed down by generations of poets. For instance, a knight would often liken his love for the lady to the pain of being wounded in battle. Your beauty wounds my soul, or my heart is pierced by your gaze. The idea was to make the knight's feelings sound elevated and noble, as if he were suffering for the sake of his lady's love. It was almost like a performance of love, a way to prove the knight's worth through his capacity for emotional suffering. But what about the common folk? Well, peasants didn't exactly have the luxury of writing grandiose poems or commissioning expensive letters from scribes. Still, the language of love had a place in their world as well, albeit a more down-to-earth version. For the lower classes, love was often expressed through simple words, gestures, and shared experiences. A man might tell his sweetheart that she was the light of his life, or that he'd work until his hands bled to provide for her. It wasn't the same lofty poetry of the court, but it was sincere, heartfelt, and rooted in the everyday struggles and joys of life. Interestingly, the idea of using poetry and flowery language to convey love wasn't exclusive to the upper classes. Even in rural villages, love poems were sometimes passed around, albeit in much simpler forms. Villagers would often sing or recite love ballads, many of which were passed down through generations. These songs, which could be humorous or deeply emotional, were a way for people to communicate their feelings in a world where direct, open expressions of affection were often frowned upon. Historians still argue whether this elaborate language of love was a true reflection of medieval society's values, or if it was simply a way to elevate romantic expressions to the level of noble duty. Some scholars believe that these formalized expressions of love were a way to distance romantic feelings from the mundane world of marriage and politics, turning them into something sacred and higher. Others argue that it was usually a cultural tradition rooted in the concept of courtly love and aimed at making knights and noblemen appear more virtuous and heroic. Either way, the flowery language of medieval romance definitely added a sense of drama and sophistication to courtship. But let's not forget about the real humor and quirks of medieval love. As much as the language of love could be dramatic and serious, it also had its share of wit and playfulness. Many love poems, especially those written by common folk, contained playful jabs or cheeky humor. You might find a poem that humorously addressed the ups and downs of love, or one that poked fun at the ridiculousness of certain courtly love conventions. For instance, some poets wrote about how they were willing to suffer through all kinds of tortures, literally and figuratively, for their lady's affection. But it was all wrapped in a layer of sarcasm that hinted at how over-the-top and impractical these ideals could be. And then, of course, there were the love songs that were actually more like bawdy humor, with lines that might make you cringe today, but were considered playful and harmless back then. These were songs that involved witty double meanings, sexual innuendos, or humorous commentary on love and relationships. The contrast between the elevated, almost divine language of the knights and the earthy humor of the common folk tells you a lot about how love was viewed across different social classes. Historians continue to debate whether the idolized and sometimes absurd language of medieval love was merely a social performance, or if it reflected a deeper, more genuine emotional experience. On one hand, these formalized expressions of love allowed knights to show devotion in a socially acceptable manner, but on the other hand, they also created an atmosphere in which real emotions could be hidden behind elaborate metaphors and idealized notions of romance. What we do know is that despite the differences in how love was expressed across social classes, there was one universal truth. Love was something worth talking about, whether it was through grand gestures, poetic letters, or simple words. People were trying to convey their feelings in the best way they knew how, and despite all the drama, all the ritual, and all the poetic flourishes, love still found a way to break through the walls of society's expectations. As we've seen so far, medieval dating and love were far from conventional in our modern sense, with formal rituals, highly structured courtships, and social pressures that governed romantic relationships. But what about the famous lovers, the ones whose stories have survived centuries of retelling, whose love was larger than life? From royal alliances to tragic tales, medieval history is rich with couples who embodied the passion, drama, and struggles of love in ways that still capture our imaginations today. One of the most iconic medieval couples was the infamous Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine and King Henry II of England. Their relationship was the stuff of legend, full of political intrigue, passionate battles for power, and, yes, genuine affection. When Eleanor married Henry in 1152, she was already a powerful and wealthy queen in her own right. The match wasn't based solely on love, but on political strategy. However, as often happens in medieval love stories, passion grew from this strategic union. Eleanor and Henry had one of the most tumultuous marriages in medieval history. Despite their strong bond early on, they were constantly at odds, especially as Henry's infidelities became well known. The king's numerous affairs were a source of tension, and it's said that Eleanor and Henry's relationship, while once passionate, eventually descended into a battlefield of political maneuvering. Eleanor even rebelled against Henry, joining forces with their sons in an attempt to seize the throne from him. But throughout it all, their relationship remained one of the most famous and fiery love stories of the medieval world. Even if they weren't always on the best of terms, their connection, fraught with emotion and drama, was undeniably profound. Then there's the legendary story of Tristan and Isolde. Though fictional, their tale was inspired by real-life figures and became one of the most beloved stories in medieval literature. Tristan, a knight of the Round Table, and Isolde, an Irish princess, were meant to be married off to others. However, through a series of unfortunate events, including a love potion. Tristan and Isolde fall in love with each other, setting off a passionate, doomed love affair that spans the entire length of the legend. Their story is filled with jealousy, betrayal, and heartbreak, but it also contains the classic medieval themes of loyalty, sacrifice, and the tension between love and duty. What makes their story so captivating is the idea of tragic love. Two people who are destined to be together, yet cannot be. They are forever bound by their love for one another, but they're never truly able to be together without devastating consequences. This kind of love, built on longing and longing alone, was one of the central themes in medieval romance. While Tristan and Isolde were not real historical figures, their story speaks to the idealized version of love that many medieval lovers aspired to, and it reflects the kind of yearning and sacrifice that defined the romantic relationships of the time. And then there's the case of Abelard and Heloise, another tale that is as much about intellectual passion as it is about physical love. Abelard, a famous philosopher and scholar, and Heloise, a brilliant young woman, shared a deep intellectual connection that soon turned into a passionate love affair. Their relationship, however, was fraught with problems from the very beginning. Heloise became pregnant, and to protect her reputation, Abelard had to marry her in secret. But after a series of unfortunate events, including Abelard's castration, which was carried out by Heloise's uncle, the two were separated, but they continued to exchange letters filled with deep emotional longing and philosophical reflection. Their relationship, though tragic, was a powerful testament to the strength of intellectual and emotional connection. Despite the physical distance between them, their letters remain one of the most passionate exchanges in medieval history, filled with yearning, regret, and deep affection. Abelard and Heloise's story demonstrates the conflict between love and intellectual pursuits, as well as the weight of societal expectations that often overshadowed personal desires. These famous stars and their tales have persisted over time because they capture something universal. Love, in its purest form, is always complicated, full of conflict and contradiction. Whether it's the fiery political alliance between Eleanor and Henry, the tragic, doomed love of Tristan and Isolde, or the intellectual passion of Abelard and Heloise, these stories all showcase the intense, often difficult nature of love during the medieval period. And while the circumstances of their relationships were shaped by the social, political, and religious structures of their time, their emotions remain deeply human. Historians still debate the extent to which these legendary relationships reflect the actual experiences of medieval lovers, or whether they are merely exaggerated versions of real events designed to entertain and elevate the ideals of love. What is clear, though, is that the passion, conflict, and longing in these stories were reflections of the emotional truths that medieval people experienced. Even when their love was complicated by duty or circumstance, these lovers held on to the hope of finding connection in a world that didn't always make space for personal desires. Despite the social pressures and restrictions of the medieval world, these couples, whether real or fictional, show that love could still thrive in unexpected ways, even if it was often entangled with power, sacrifice, and deep personal turmoil. Love in the medieval era wasn't all candlelit castles and grand chivalric gestures. It could be dangerous, often life-threatening. As we know, marriage wasn't just about love. It was about alliances, power, and family. But what happens when love defies all the political, religious, and societal expectations? Well, that's when things get complicated and sometimes dangerous. Lovers could easily find themselves at the center of conflict, where their personal feelings didn't matter nearly as much as the greater forces at play. Consider, for example, the case of royal marriages and the drama that often unfolded in a time when power and land were everything. Marriages were more about securing alliances than about love. And if you were in love with someone you weren't supposed to be with, well, that could lead to quite the mess. One of the most famous and dangerous examples of this is the love affair between King Henry VIII of England and Anne Boleyn. Henry was so smitten by Anne that he broke with the Catholic Church, creating a rift that led to the English Reformation. He needed a son, and after his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, failed to produce one. Henry decided to marry Anne instead. This decision, based solely on his desire for a male heir and his intense personal affection for Anne, led to a series of events that would shape the history of England forever. Anne was crowned queen, but her love for Henry ultimately led to her tragic end. After 3 years of marriage, Anne was executed for treason. Some historians argue that it was more a matter of political survival for Henry than it was about Anne's actual guilt. Henry was willing to break from Rome, destroy his marriage, and kill for love, proving just how high the stakes were when emotions and politics collided. The case of Henry and Anne shows how love could be dangerous, not just for the lovers themselves, but for an entire country. And then there's the story of Eleanor of Aquitaine again. But this time, her love and ambition would lead to something even darker. Eleanor was married to Louis VII of France, but their marriage was annulled after years of tension, most of which stemmed from their inability to produce a male heir. After the annulment, Eleanor married Henry II of England, which put her at the center of a struggle for power that defined much of her life. Eleanor, ever the political force, found herself at odds with her husband after he began having an affair with Rosamond Clifford, a beautiful young woman who captured Henry's heart. Eleanor's response: she supported a rebellion against Henry, encouraging their sons to rise up against him. It was a complex situation. Her love for Henry was now overshadowed by political ambition and the bitter betrayal of his affair. It's a striking example of how love could turn into rivalry, where the line between affection and political gain became blurred. Eleanor's story is a vivid example of how powerful love could be, even when it ultimately led to turmoil and war. Historians still debate whether these royal love stories, Henry and Anne, Eleanor and Henry, were more about personal feelings or political maneuvering. Were these acts of love or acts of power? Was Anne's tragic end the result of a king's broken heart? Or was it the inevitable consequence of a marriage based on political necessity rather than genuine affection? For Eleanor, was it a love for her husband that drove her to rebel? Or was it the desire to gain power for herself and her children? These dangerous love stories raise questions about the role love played in medieval power dynamics. Were lovers simply pawns in a larger game, or did their passions genuinely dictate the course of history? What we do know is that medieval lovers often found themselves in situations where their emotions weren't just personal. They had the potential to reshape kingdoms, define dynasties, and change the course of history. This theme of love and danger wasn't just limited to royals. Love could be a double-edged sword, even for commoners. When you lived in a time where family lineage and social status determined your worth, pursuing a relationship outside of the established norms could have severe consequences. A forbidden love could lead to exile, punishment, or even death, depending on the context. In fact, some of the most tragic love stories of the medieval period are those that were born out of rebellion. Lovers who defied their families, their social classes, or even the church. Take the example of two lovers who were caught between forbidden love and the harsh realities of medieval society. The star-crossed lovers of Verona. The tale of Romeo and Juliet, though fictional, is grounded in the realities of medieval courtship and family politics. In Shakespeare's play, the lovers' families are bitter enemies, and their love ultimately leads to death and destruction. But beneath the dramatic flair, there's a very real lesson. Love in the medieval world often came with deadly consequences when it defied social boundaries. Whether you were in the court of a king or the lowliest village, love was never simple. It was always complicated by the structures around you, and those who dared to step outside the lines often paid the price. Historians continue to debate whether medieval society truly understood the complexities of romantic love, or whether it was something that was so overshadowed by politics, religion, and duty that it was ultimately doomed to fail. Some argue that the medieval world simply wasn't ready to embrace love in the way we do today. Perhaps it was too deeply rooted in survival and the maintenance of power. Others believe that, despite the overwhelming obstacles, love in the medieval period was just as powerful and pure as it is today, even if it was often buried beneath the weight of duty. The danger of love in the medieval period is what makes many of these stories so compelling. Whether it was a royal marriage that ended in tragedy or a forbidden affair that led to rebellion, love had the power to transform not just individuals, but entire kingdoms. The consequences of love in the medieval world were always high, and often love itself wasn't enough to shield lovers from the forces of history, as we've already seen. Love in the medieval period was rarely just about the couple involved. It was influenced by politics, society, and even the very real threat of disease. In fact, one of the more sobering aspects of medieval love was the constant shadow of death that loomed over relationships. The Black Plague, which swept across Europe in the 14th century, was an ever-present reminder that life, love, and happiness could be interrupted at any moment. The plague didn't just kill people, it disrupted entire societies and shattered families. For couples, love took on a new urgency. Imagine this. You're in the midst of a deadly pandemic, and the person you love might be taken from you at any moment. Medieval lovers didn't just fear separation due to social boundaries or political concerns. They feared the very real possibility of losing their partners to illness. For the nobility, this meant not only the loss of a loved one, but also the loss of political power. And for common folk, the plague could wipe out entire villages, tearing apart the very fabric of family and community. For those who managed to survive the plague, the emotional toll was heavy. The loss of a partner, whether from the plague or any other cause, could leave someone emotionally devastated. It wasn't uncommon for widows and widowers to never remarry, instead choosing to remain devoted to the memory of their lost love. The constant threat of death made medieval love both more intense and more fragile. As one might imagine, the desire to connect with another person in such a turbulent time was heightened because, as medieval people knew all too well, love could be taken away in an instant. In fact, historians still argue about how much the Black Plague affected the social structures of medieval Europe. Some believe that the widespread devastation of the plague led to a weakening of traditional bonds as people's lives were disrupted and reshaped in the wake of death. Others suggest that it led to an increased emphasis on the importance of family and emotional connections as people sought comfort and solace in one another during such uncertain times. But the plague wasn't the only disease that ravaged medieval society. Syphilis, for instance, became rampant in Europe in the late medieval period, likely spread by soldiers returning from the Americas. The disease became a persistent threat to lovers and spouses alike, and for medieval people, the fear of contracting a disease that could cause so much physical pain and social stigma added another layer of stress to relationships. In a time when people had little understanding of disease transmission, the fear of being contaminated by a lover or spouse was a very real concern. In the world of love and marriage, this made things even more complicated. Relationships were often more about survival and creating heirs than they were about true romantic love. For the nobility, The idea of maintaining pure bloodlines was paramount. Marriages were arranged to ensure alliances and consolidate wealth. And that's where disease, especially sexually transmitted diseases like syphilis, could complicate everything. If one partner became infected, it could mean the end of the marriage, a fractured bloodline, or a political disaster. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Despite the threat of disease, there were still moments of tenderness and care. Couples continued to find ways to express affection for one another, whether through small tokens like gifts, letters, or even just spending time together. However fleeting that time might be, the risk of death might have made the moments of connection all the more precious, and perhaps the fear of loss deepened the emotional bonds that couples shared. This danger of disease, along with the constant threat of sudden death, led to a certain intensity in relationships. Medieval lovers were often acutely aware of the fragility of life, which made every kiss, every glance, every stolen moment all the more meaningful. While love in medieval times was certainly shaped by external factors, including politics, social expectations, and disease, it was also about human connection. In the face of danger and uncertainty, people found ways to express their love and devotion. No matter how fleeting or precarious those connections might have been, historians continue to debate how much of medieval love was shaped by these fears and external pressures. Was love, in the end, something that transcended all of these challenges? Or was it simply a reaction to the precariousness of life? The medieval period's constant struggle with death, disease, and uncertainty certainly made love more complicated, but it also made it more urgent and meaningful in ways we might not always appreciate. As we think about the role of disease in medieval love, we are reminded of the fragility of life and the fleeting nature of human connection. In a world where death could come at any moment, the value of love, however it was expressed, was undeniable. Love might have been overshadowed by disease and disaster, but it never disappeared. In fact, it may have flourished in ways that were more profound than we could ever imagine. Love in the medieval world was fragile, yes, but it was also tenacious, finding its way even in the darkest of times. In the medieval era, love didn't always adhere to the norms of society, and some couples chose to defy the expectations placed on them by their families, social classes, and even the church. Forbidden love, the kind that existed in secret or broke all the rules, had its own unique place in medieval society. Though such relationships were frowned upon and often resulted in severe consequences, they were also an essential part of the broader tapestry of medieval romance. One of the most well-known types of forbidden love in the medieval period was the love between individuals of different social classes. Imagine a noblewoman falling in love with a commoner, or a knight having an affair with a servant. Such a love would have been considered scandalous and dangerous, but that didn't stop some people from seeking out connections outside of their class. And in certain cases, these forbidden relationships were marked by a sense of excitement and rebellion. Take, for example, the story of William Marshall, one of the most celebrated knights of the medieval period. Marshall was born into a family of minor nobility and rose to fame through his skill as a knight. While his romantic life wasn't marked by scandal in the same way as some others, it's clear that love was never simple for him. He was married to Isabel de Clare, a rich heiress, but there were rumors of his involvement with several women throughout his life, including one of the daughters of the king. These relationships, while never publicly confirmed as romantic affairs, were indicative of the complex social dynamics that allowed such forbidden loves to exist, even if they remained secret. The story of Tristan and Isolde, which we've mentioned before, also fits within this context of forbidden love. While the love between Tristan, a knight, and Isolde, an Irish princess, was never condoned by their families, their passion endured despite all the obstacles they faced. In many ways, this tale was a reflection of the conflict between personal desire and the expectations of family, duty, and society. Their love was fated to end tragically, but it has remained one of the most enduring symbols of passionate, forbidden love. But it wasn't just class differences that led to forbidden love. In medieval times, religious barriers could do the same. The church had a significant influence over marriages and relationships, and this was especially true for individuals who had taken religious vows. Monks and nuns, bound by chastity, were often at the heart of some of the most tragic love stories in medieval history. Take, for example, the story of Abelard and Heloise. Abelard, a philosopher and theologian, fell in love with Heloise, a brilliant young woman, but their love affair caused scandal in the church. Heloise's uncle, angry at their affair, had Abelard castrated, and both Heloise and Abelard were forced to take vows of celibacy. The couple's love letters, which have survived through the centuries, are filled with both deep affection and regret. Despite the tragedy of their situation, Abelard and Heloise's correspondence reveals a love that transcended societal and religious expectations. Their story is a striking example of how love could not only defy societal barriers, but also persist despite extreme consequences. In the case of forbidden love between people who were forbidden by law or social convention to be together, the consequences could be dire. Lovers who crossed the boundaries of class, religion, or societal norms faced harsh punishments. For instance, a noble woman involved in an affair with a commoner could be disinherited or cast out of her family, while the commoner himself could face exile, imprisonment, or worse. If the affair was uncovered by the church, it could lead to excommunication or severe penance. These risks made forbidden love all the more intense, as the lovers knew that they were defying not just social norms, but the very structures that kept their world in balance. The stories of forbidden love were often romanticized in medieval literature, but in reality, they were a reflection of the human desire to to break free from societal constraints. Love, even in the medieval period, was a force that could not always be controlled or contained. Despite the risks, people found ways to pursue connections that transcended the rules. Some of these relationships were fleeting, while others endured and were remembered for centuries. Historians continue to debate the extent to which forbidden love was a reality for most people in the medieval world. Was it more of a literary construct, or did real-life lovers regularly defy the rules of society? While we may never know for sure, the fact that so many tales of forbidden love have survived through the ages suggests that the desire to break free from societal expectations was a deeply felt emotion, one that resonated across classes, religions, and boundaries. In a way, these forbidden loves reflect the complexity of medieval society itself, a world where love and power were deeply intertwined, and where the risk of personal happiness was often measured against the greater needs of family, land, and wealth. And yet, in the face of all this, people still found ways to reach out and connect with each other, even when it meant challenging everything they knew. Whether it was a knight and a noblewoman defying their families, or a monk and a nun breaking their vows, these stories of forbidden love remind us that passion has always been a force to reckon with, even in the most restrictive of times. As we near the end of our journey through the labyrinth of medieval love, it's worth taking a step back and reflecting on the enduring influence of these romantic tales and societal structures on how we understand relationships today. The medieval period, with its rules, rituals, and challenges, laid the foundation for many modern concepts of love, marriage, and courtship. And despite all the complexities and constraints that governed love in those times, one thing remains clear. Love was never simple, but it was always deeply human. What's fascinating about medieval love stories is that they weren't just limited to knights and princesses or kings and queens. The themes of longing, sacrifice, and devotion were universal, transcending social classes and even the rigid boundaries of time. Whether it was the passionate, often tragic love between royalty, the quiet and practical affection shared by peasants, or the forbidden romances that crossed lines of class and religion, medieval lovers experienced the same deep emotions we still feel today. Love in the medieval world was shaped by so many forces: power, religion, duty, and survival. And yet, despite the obstacles, it was never entirely extinguished. In fact, in many ways, love was more intense in medieval times, precisely because it existed in such a turbulent, dangerous world. The ever-present threat of death from disease, war, or political turmoil made love both fragile and vital. For those who lived through such uncertainty, every moment of affection was precious, fleeting, and often profoundly life-altering. Take, for example, the stories of medieval lovers who found each other during times of crisis, such as during the Black Plague or the Crusades. for these individuals. Love wasn't just a way of connecting with another person. It was a way of holding on to humanity in a world that felt increasingly uncertain and hostile. The relationships forged in these moments of crisis were often the most passionate and intense, driven by the shared understanding that life was fragile and could be lost at any time. Despite the social structures that tried to control love, whether through arranged marriages, religious restrictions, or societal expectations, people still found ways to break free. Forbidden love, secret affairs, and passionate connections persisted in the face of political and social pressures. These relationships weren't just acts of defiance. They were the embodiment of the human desire for connection and intimacy, and in a time when personal happiness was often sacrificed for the greater good. These love stories stand as a testament to the resilience of the heart. It's also worth noting that while the medieval world was deeply rooted in tradition, it also sowed the seeds for the romantic ideals we hold today. Courtly love, with its emphasis on devotion, sacrifice, and unattainable beauty, has left a lasting mark on literature, art, and even modern-day notions of romance. The grand gestures of knights and the longing looks exchanged across banquet halls may seem exaggerated to us now, but they helped shape how we view love in the present day. These stories taught us that love, while complicated, is worth pursuing, and sometimes it's the struggle itself that makes love so profound. Historians still argue about whether medieval love was as sincere as the literature suggests. Was it all an elaborate performance, a way to bolster social status and power, or was there a deeper, more authentic emotion beneath the layers of societal expectations? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in between. While love in the medieval period was undeniably influenced by the strict social order of the time, it was also a deeply personal experience, and one that shaped the course of history in ways we still feel today. So, what can we take away from all this? The medieval world may seem like a distant, foreign place, but the stories of love, loss, and longing that defined it are universal, whether through the grand, dramatic tales of kings and queens, the quieter, more practical relationships of the common folk, or the forbidden loves that broke all the rules. Medieval romance teaches us that love is never easy, but it is always worth fighting for. And maybe, just maybe, that's the one thing that hasn't changed over the centuries. Now, as we bring this journey to a close, remember that love in the medieval world was not just about following the rules. It was about challenging them, whether in grand, noble courtships or quiet, secret exchanges. Love in the medieval era was complex, multifaceted, and deeply human. And while the world may have changed, the emotions that drove those ancient lovers are still with us today, reminding us that no matter the time or place, love remains one of the most powerful forces in the world.